Okay, good afternoon. A warm welcome to Europe House to all our distinguished guests. Let me introduce myself. My name is András Kós. I'm the Security and Defense Counselor of the European Union Delegation to the United Kingdom. And I would like to give a special welcome to our panelists, Keir Giles, the author of the book Who Will Defend Europe, and Edward Lucas, journalist and security expert. They will have a discussion on a very topical issue, which is Europe's readiness in the face of growing threats from Russia and the Russian aggression. But I would also like to express our big thank you to Olesia, the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London, for the excellent cooperation we have developed in the past few years. Before handing over to Olesia and then to Keir and Edward, let me just make a few remarks. Firstly, on where the European Union stands and what it does in responding to Russia's war of aggression and supporting Ukraine. And secondly, what is the European Union doing in taking more responsibility for its security? So first of all, on Ukraine, I think the bottom line is very clear. Since now we are more than 3 years into Russia's unjustified full-scale invasion, the EU remains completely committed to supporting Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and this remains a clear priority. We stand by Ukraine to achieve peace through strength, and that requires for Ukraine to be in the strongest possible position with its own robust military and defense capabilities. Ukraine's security is Europe's security, it's our security. If Russia gets away with its aggression, we will live in a world where might makes right, and we must do our best to avoid that. In line with this approach, the European Union remains fully committed to providing further comprehensive support to Ukraine and its people, as it is exercising its inherent right to self-defense. Let me just briefly illustrate what this support means in concrete. First of all, the overall EU assistance to Ukraine amounts to almost 143 billion euros in financial, military, and humanitarian assistance. Almost 75 billion was made available so far in financial and budget support, as well as humanitarian assistance. And also, the European Union has provided almost 50 billion, exactly 49.6 billion euros of military support, and I would say this is historic because we haven't done that before in the history of the Union. And also, I would like to mention the 1.5 billion euro proceeding from the Russian immobilized assets. In addition, let me just mention that the European Union remains the largest provider of military training. We have our training mission, the EU Military Assistance Mission, which has trained nearly 73,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and obviously more to come. And just to recall the excellent cooperation in this regard, what we have with the United Kingdom's training mission, Interflex. When it comes to responding to Russia's aggression, the European Union, we have adopted 16 packages of restrictive measures, and the European Union remains ready to step up further pressure on Russia, including through sanctions and by strengthening the enforcement of existing measures. And finally, when it comes to our approach to Ukraine, to recall that ensuring full accountability for war crimes and other crimes related to Russia's aggression remains a key priority as well. So the EU supports the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office to strengthen its capacities to investigate and prosecute international crimes. When it comes to the peace prospects, the EU continues to support Ukraine to reach a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, which is based on the UN Charter and international law, and which is backed with robust and credible security guarantees to deter future Russian aggressions, and also to deter the inhumane and horrifying attacks like the one that occurred during the weekend in Kryvyi Rih. A ceasefire can be an important step in this direction, and as to the United States proposal, Russia must respond with an unconditional yes, like Ukraine did. There is no space for stalling anymore, and the EU stands ready to play its part in supporting upcoming steps. When it comes to the peace, I think the parameters are pretty much clear. There can be no negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no negotiations that affect European security without Europe. A ceasefire should be part of the overall process, and Ukraine, as I already referred to, needs robust and credible security guarantees to prevent future aggression. And it is for Ukraine to choose its future. Nobody else has a say in this one. Peace must firmly uphold Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. My second remark would relate to European defense, which is also very much in line with what is happening in Ukraine, because the aggression by Russia has clearly demonstrated that the post-Cold War era of peace dividend, if you will, is gone. The continent is faced with clear dangers on a scale never seen before, at least since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Russia will remain a long-term threat to the European Union and to the European security. And therefore, strengthening defense capabilities is absolutely crucial. Now I think Europe is ready to speed up, ramp up, and scale up at once. And it is in this vein that the white paper on defense issued by the EU High Representative and the Commission a few weeks ago is setting up what the EU can do to enhance member states' defense. I think this white paper makes it clear for a case for a once-in-a-generation surge in European defense, a surge in investment, a surge in capabilities, and in readiness to achieve a strong European defense by 2030. The main pillars are probably known, so let me just briefly refer to the main elements. The first one is investing in defense more than ever before. With the so-called reaffirm plan, the European Union is creating a fiscal space for member states to spend 800 billion euros, and 150 billion of which will be EU loans to member states for common procurement. And this is common procurement of priority capabilities which are fully coherent with NATO. The second element is filling urgent capability gaps, such as drones, anti-drone systems, air and missile defense, artificial intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, artillery systems. The third element is continuing to support and integrate Ukraine. So here is the linkage, what I have said before. We will speed up joint procurement, common projects, and financing. And Ukraine is a red thread across all the actions that I have referred to. And the final element is continuing to work with partners. This is something that is in the DNA in the European Union. So this is why we have established the SAFE instrument, which is the abbreviation for Security Action for Europe, and we are offering important opportunities for like-minded partners to join up with member states in defense projects. So to conclude, just to say that there is a clear recognition and understanding now that it is first and foremost the responsibility of Europe to be able to defend itself. And to this end, we need the necessary capabilities, and all that I have referred to is about this. We need a Europe that is a stronger security actor, and a stronger security actor is a more reliable partner that can more effectively protect the international rule-based order, and the security actor that can more effectively support our Ukrainian friends. I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. So I give the floor to Ernst.
Thank you very much. Good evening. So good to see so many of you on such a sunny day in London. My name is Olesa Kromachuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We're an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture in the UK and beyond. And I'm very grateful to Andras Kosh, to Ambassador Pedro Serrano, who sadly isn't here with us today, and to the wonderful team of the EU delegation to the UK for hosting us once again in Europe House and for partnering on this very important discussion. I can't think of a more fitting venue for a discussion about the future of European defense. I just wanted to stress that this discussion is being recorded, is going to be posted on the UIL's YouTube channel, so you can share it with your friends, but also bear in mind when you ask your questions. And also we're taking some photos. If you don't want to appear on them, just wave to one of us, one of the members of UIL staff, and we'll make sure to respect your wishes. At the UIL, we view Ukraine as a rich source of invaluable experience and absolutely vital knowledge, and we strive to share lessons that it offers, from issues of justice and environmental challenges to the realities of neo-imperial warfare. Ukraine has so much to teach us all, and we aim to help the international community, including here in the UK, to engage meaningfully with those lessons, especially in pursuit of democratic security in Europe and beyond. And this evening's discussion on European defense will no doubt reflect on lessons from Ukraine, perhaps those that have already been learned or are yet to be learned from Ukraine, from the people of Ukraine, from Ukraine's armed forces. As the United States reassesses its role in European security, Ukrainians have looked to Europe with cautious hope. There has been some reassurance in seeing most European leaders reaffirm their support for Ukraine and express commitment to strengthen their own defenses. But what that support actually looks like in practice and what's at stake if it falters are the questions that remain both urgent and complex. And to help us unpack these questions, we are very fortunate to have absolutely two brilliant speakers with us tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. We'll be hearing from Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. Keir works with the Conflict Studies Research Centre in the UK and has over 30 years of experience in studying Russian information warfare. He has held advisory roles for NATO, the US Army War College, and other defense institutions. He authored key works on Russian cyber and information warfare, including Moscow Rules, published in 2019, Russia's War on Everybody, published in 2022, and his most recent book, Who Will Defend Europe, that was published last year, which I'm sure we'll discuss at length today. And you can purchase any of these books by scanning QR codes helpfully supplied by Keir, which will be available later on over there in the reception area. And Keir will be in conversation with Edward Lucas, author and journalist, whose expertise include energy, cybersecurity, espionage, information warfare, and Russian foreign policy and security. Ed is a former
They're all the
senior...
same thing.
Indeed. Ed is a former senior editor at The Economist, and I'm sure you've read his analysis in the past. Following the discussion between Ed and Keir, there will be a chance for you to ask your questions, so please think of those as you listen to our speakers. And there'll also be an opportunity to continue this conversation more informally over some refreshments after we finish. Thank you all for joining us. Keir and Ed, the floor is yours.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is really please do buy Keir's book. I just wanted to pick up, I think in a sense, first of all, how many Ukrainians in the audience? Hands up in Ukrainians. Well, thank you very much for defending us. And I'm really sorry that despite everything we've done, it's been so little and so late. And there are 2 points I wanted to pick up on from Mr. Kosh's introduction, just as a preliminary.
Only 2.
As a preliminary. And the first is that I think that the big defeat of the war has already happened, because it's clear that nuclear blackmail works. And we can't blame Donald Trump for that. That was something that happened under Biden. But Russia's nuclear saber-rattling stopped us doing what we should have done, which was to give Ukraine the weapons and the support that it needed to win at a time when it was on the front foot. And the rest of the world has looked at that and drawn a very bleak and very powerful lesson. Don't give up your nuclear weapons, no matter what anybody else says. And if you haven't got nuclear weapons, see about getting them. And amid the ruins of Pax Americana, and we can get onto that later, the most dangerous development is that countries no longer trust the American nuclear umbrella, and they think we better get ours. And the nuclear brinkmanship we've seen with Iran over the past 20 or 30 years is nothing compared with what we're going to see in this new nuclear scramble. The second thing is, I'm delighted that the European Union says there should be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening. We are seeing our great nightmare, whether it was Rapallo or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or now the talks in Riyadh, of European countries' destiny being decided by other big countries who may have their own sinister common objectives, and they're making decisions over the head of us Europeans. So we're heading very much towards the classicists in the audience will recognise at once in a world in which the mighty powers do the deals that they can, and the weak do the deals they must. And the big question facing Europe is, do we turn ourselves into a superpower so we make our own decisions, or do we accept what's dished out to us? Keir, how optimistic are you about all that?
You mentioned one big defeat. It's not the only one that comes out from Ondras's speech. If you listen to the European Union's stated priorities and its policy and its commitment, you're listening to things that have already faded into the past. The commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity. On a very simplistic level, well, obviously it's nonsense. Anybody that is fully committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity and defending it will be on the front lines, defending it, trying to keep Russia out. But on a more practical level, that aspiration for not just a lasting peace, but also a just one, is already long gone. The time to achieve a just peace was before February 2022, at which time there was an option for deterring Russia, but one that was not taken. Or shortly afterwards, when it would have been possible to rescue Ukraine through decisive action from a coalition of the willing, of the kind that is only now 3 years later being discussed. So all of these things have already happened, as well as the negotiations over the head, not just of Ukraine, but of Europe, that Ed was talking about already. Unfortunately, it's a symptom of something that not just the European Union, but also too many of our national governments are prone to, which is a big gap between say and do, between the verbal commitments to what Ukraine stands for and how Ukraine stands for all of us, and what countries are actually willing to do about it. And, of course, for as long as that gap persists, we will be faced with precisely that challenge. Our future is going to be determined elsewhere. It's going to be determined in a conversation between Moscow and Washington. And the small countries around the periphery, those that do not scramble to acquire nuclear weapons as rapidly as they can, are going to be caught in the fallout. Let's think not just about Europe, let's think about countries like Canada that had a permanent alliance, so it believed, that has now turned into its worst nightmare. All of these things require not just words, but actual action. And if Europe is to have a say in its own future, It needs to insert itself into the conversation about its future through decisive action now to ensure that it actually has a say in how that future is to be determined. And that means, if you are talking about a coalition of the willing to sustain Ukraine, not making it conditional on conditions that have already been negated, saying that this cannot happen without a US backstop, which the United States has already said very clearly and many times it is not going to provide. Making it conditional upon Russian acquiescence, which is a nonsense, because Russia will never agree to something which is specifically designed to frustrate Russia. Instead, rather than looking to cooperation with the United States, which is already a dead letter, European countries should be moving now to make themselves relevant in defense terms to their own future. And of course, that defense still starts at the front line in Ukraine. Now, sadly, it may be that after 30 years of defense drawdowns in countries like the UK, the military advice to our political leaders may be that that is not actually possible. It could be that the reason why here in the UK we had a rapid turnaround from Keir Starmer, from one day saying, well, of course the UK has to be in the lead in a force to go into Ukraine to ensure that peace is sustained, and then 48 hours later saying, well, actually, no, we can't do that without the Americans. It could be that's the result of him finally getting some honest advice from the Ministry of Defence about what is actually left in terms of British armed force. But that puts us in front of even more severe strategic choices. Because if European militaries, including the supposed military heavyweights, the mini superpowers of Western Europe, aren't able to deploy a force to its own neighbourhood and expect it to survive if Russia does not want it to be there, then those armed forces are effectively pointless. And then you're faced with the choice of, well, what can we defend? How far back do we have to retreat? What is the core that can actually be preserved if we have armed forces that are only capable of preserving that core? All of these conversations are things which should be being worked out urgently now across European capitals, as well as the key technical issues of what exactly can European countries actually do if the United States is not cooperating or is actively opposing them. We hope some people, somewhere, have answers, but we also hope that those answers are going to translate into action very shortly before it is too late. And that means moving at what some people like to call the speed of relevance, or putting it another way, at a speed which is distinctly uncomfortable for most European capitals west of Warsaw.
The point that barely needs making is that if we'd done this earlier, it would be a great deal less expensive, it would be a great deal less inconvenient, and it would be a great deal more likely that it would work. And we are now in a position where all our options are bad. And I'm not hearing that from our decision makers. There's a kind of paradox here that the countries in the front line are the most capable countries. It's the countries behind them that should be the reserve that come and help in a crisis that are the weak ones. So we have immensely impressive defence and security efforts in countries like Finland, which can get more soldiers, men and women, into uniform in a shorter space of time than any other country in Europe, and possibly relative to population in the world. Anyone here from Finland? That's good, because Finns hate it being praised. It's great fun to praise Finns. They get extremely embarrassed and start saying, well, of course, we're not that good, you know. But actually, Finland's brilliant. We have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which, as I always have to say, have been warning us about this since the 1990s, since the early 1990s, and the people who gave those warnings weren't just ignored, they were patronised and belittled, including by officials who work in places very close to this building. We also have Poland, which is turning itself into a serious military power. But of course, those countries can't go and help Ukraine because they're needing all their efforts to defend themselves. And it's the Old West, the so-called superpowers, Britain, France, Germany, which are so caught on the hop with the lack of defence combat power that they can project. But I'm actually more worried about something else. It's not just that we can't defend Ukraine, we can't really defend ourselves. And this is one of the things that Keir lays bare in his book, is this extraordinary lack of homeland defence. We have, on a good day, if one of our Type 45 destroyers is seaworthy, an extremely capable warship which can shoot I think it's a golf ball or tennis ball going at the speed of sound 50 miles away, can shoot it down with an extremely impressive and very expensive missile. And it has 48 of those on board, so if the Russians hurl 48 exploding golf balls at us, every one of them will be shot down. Problem comes when the 49th comes, because the Type 45 has to go and reload. There's only one crane in this country that can reload from our absolutely secret stockpile, which I read in the papers is, I think, 140 missiles. That's the next 140 exploding golf balls. And that crane is at Portsmouth. But unfortunately, if the Type 45 destroyer is protecting London, parked in the Thames estuary, Portsmouth will be a smoking ruin. I wonder if anyone in the audience knows where the next nearest crane is that could reload a Type 45 destroyer with air defence missiles. How?
Edward, I found out a different answer.
Well, I was told it was Norfolk, Virginia, but Keir's got a better one.
Gibraltar.
Gibraltar. Fantastic. Much closer. So we'll be all right then, assuming Gibraltar's all right. But Keir, are we looking at this the wrong way? I mean, during the Cold War, we did have serious air defences in this country, and we had a sort of whole range of different defence and resilience efforts. We dismantled them all. If you talk to people up the road, turn right, in that big building, they will say, but we don't need to do all that because we have other forms of defending ourselves through deterrence, and we have this fantastic deterrence. The Russians would never dare do these things they could do to Britain because we'd whack them so hard they wish they hadn't. Does that still hold?
I don't know who you're hearing this from, because all of the people I have that conversation with now just go very quiet. The conversation that we're having more publicly is not only about the non-existent state of this country's conventional defence, not just against air and missile attack, but also civil defence and resilience, and what happens if you do suffer, for instance, a non-military attack like massed cyber, massed sabotage. Think of the ransomware attacks against hospitals, but extended across critical infrastructure and turning the lights out and the power off for all of us. And we've made major steps forward in this country under the previous government, where the recognition that there was no civil defence system whatsoever led to the creation of a website with emergency advice. And it's uniquely on brand for the UK that the information resource for emergencies is one that will be unavailable when the power is out and the internet is down. But the really useful thing about this website was it made it very plain that when you are in an emergency, when you have visited on you something that is a tiny fraction of what we see delivered against people in Ukraine and against Gaza, when your apartment or your house is destroyed, or you're sitting there with no light, no power, no heat, no food distribution, where do you go for help? And the answer is clear: you don't. There is no help. Unlike countries like Finland, where there are well-developed emergency preparedness routines, there are shelters, there are evacuation routes, there are centralized food supplies, this country has nothing. And of course you don't have healthcare resources. If you have a health service that is already in crisis before you actually have a crisis, then when you need all of those extra beds for mass casualties, there's a bit of a problem. But it leads us to the other question that we get asked quite often: well, why and how would Russia attack this country instead of the frontline states? Partly because of what Edward said. The frontline states are far better prepared. They are hard targets. It is hard to attack them, and if you do attack them, the return on investment is limited because they are ready and prepared for it, mentally and psychologically, as well as in terms of civil defense, stocks, systems, mindset, resilience. Unlike Western Europe. Now, some of our friends in the Ministry of Defence have quite knowingly told us that we are relatively safe because we have the whole of Europe between us and Russia, which is very reassuring as long as you don't remember that the world is not in fact flat. And that if you look at a globe and remember that Russian long-range aviation pilots have been practicing for 2 decades flying what they call zaugel around the corner, around the top of Norway, and that they have been developing missiles with thousands of kilometers range, then this country is intensely vulnerable. And that vulnerability is increased because we don't have any air defenses. So again, the return on investment is greater because the risk and resources that Russia could put into attacking this country would deliver much stronger and better political results than if, for example, they were to try something with Poland. Why would this country be a target? Well, let's see. Is there any country we can think of that is setting itself up as a co-leader of a coalition of the willing to go and frustrate Russia in Ukraine, but not actually doing anything about it just yet? Well, Russia would like to make very sure that that inaction continues and has written a great deal in its military doctrines about coercion and deterrence, and delivering demonstrative strikes that give just enough damage to show how bad things are going to get if you do not do what Russia wants you to do. There's such a thing as a SODCID. It's an English acronym, Strategic Operation for the Destruction of Critically Important Targets, directly translated from Russian. In other words, just as you've done in Syria and in Ukraine, take out things that keep people alive in order to show how much damage you can do in order to persuade a country that it is not worth standing up to Russia. That is the kind of thing which the United Kingdom is laying itself open as a target to by not investing in its defences to either prevent this happening or deter it or mitigate the damage when it actually takes place. Of course, it's not just the UK. This applies in varying measure to most countries that are, in the phrase that I use repeatedly in the book, west of Warsaw. It's a little bit unfair on the Norwegians, but it's still a very good general principle. That gradient from east to west of threat awareness and therefore of preparedness still holds very strong. And the further west you go, the softer the target is. Let's not even get onto Ireland, which is in a persistent state of denial about the air and sea incursions that they see from Russia and what exactly they mean for their own national security.
So that brings us back to deterrence, because it's too late for us to try and rebuild a serious defence and resilience system in this country. Even if you threw all the money you had at the problem and mobilised the population, we can't get to where Finland is because it involves a great deal of training and a great deal of building, and we're just not going to get there. So that puts a huge reliance on deterrence. And one of the things that I've really noticed over the last 20-something years is how little we have on our ladder of responses, the so-called escalation ladder, when Russia does things. So to take the first example that probably most of you will remember, the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko using an extremely dangerous and large quantity of a deadly radioactive poison in the heart of London. And we find it very difficult even to have a public inquiry about this because we're afraid of what might come out. We've had arson attacks, some public, more often not. We've had other murders. We've had extensive cyber attacks. We've had all sorts of plots and other mischief and sabotage. And the response is usually to say that we're gravely concerned and this is unacceptable. And then, having issued the press release, we chuck out Russian spies, which is great, but there aren't many more to chuck out now. But there's very little else that we can do, and we seem to be in a sort of prison of our own making about our sort of reluctance to call out these attacks for what they are, which is acts of unconventional warfare, and then to do something that would make Russia think, ouch, that hurt, I better not do that again. What should we be doing here to rebuild our escalation ladder?
Rebuilding is the word, of course, because again, as with so much else, taking this problem and dealing with it at an early stage, when it became clear that the challenge was there, decades ago, would have been far, far easier. Because the recurring pattern is, of course, if you do succeed in doing something to Russia which makes Moscow go, ouch, a boundary is set, and if it is plain that boundary is defended, and transgressing it will incur consequences, things become a great deal more peaceful with Moscow. But the decision was made long, long ago that this was not the course of action which this country and many others were actually going to take. You alluded there to the acts of unconventional warfare, and one of the policies that we have fought hard against over multiple years, and as you can tell, we've been doing this for an awfully long time, is calling things hybrid warfare, a phrase that became very fashionable back in roughly a decade ago, when NATO countries looked at what Russia had done in Crimea, decided that they didn't really understand what Russia had done in Crimea because they'd thrown away all of the old manuals for how Russia gets stuff done with its intelligence services and special forces, and thought, we need a new name for this because we don't know what it is and it's something mysterious and we don't know how to respond to it. Let's settle on hybrid warfare. Since then we've had adjective proliferation. There is hybrid warfare, there's liminal warfare, subthreshold, grey zone. Edward can probably fill in half a dozen more. But the point of all of these is to pretend that it's not war. Because none of those terms are meaningful in Russian. To Russian or Soviet educated officers, all of these things are spetsoperatsiya, they're special operations. They are things which are conducted by, often, military officers in the main intelligence directorate of the Russian armed forces.
Which incidentally is bigger than the entire British Army.
So they are in effect indistinguishable from acts of war. And that is precisely what some of our members of parliament were calling them at the time, those with a spine. But the absolute refusal to treat them as such has delivered us to where we are today. And coming back to Edward's question, what exactly could be done? Well, obviously it is going to be a great deal harder now than ever it was. But there are measures which are available and could have been taken and could now be taken. If, of course, it is true that any of the capabilities which the UK government tells us the UK has is actually true in real life, such as, for example, its much vaunted cyber power. Or to take another example we've already slightly heard alluded to, the frozen assets outside Russia, something which we've been discussing already for years, but a clear conflict between natural justice and what is morally right and common sense on the one hand, and what lawyers think is a good idea on the other hand. It is time, sadly, to move beyond the legal quibbles over exactly what can be done, because at this point it is more a matter of our continued survival than of legal niceties.
We could start with a very, very soft target, which is the £2 billion and the sale of Chelsea Football Club, and even that has defeated the attempts of the government lawyers to find a way of spending it on the cause to which it was supposed to be devoted. We haven't talked very much about the United States yet, and that is I think deserves a good 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll get onto questions. Because the answer, if we put this question in previous years about who will defend Europe, the answer would be the Americans. And that was actually in their interests. We outsourced our defence to them, and we also, to a large extent, outsourced our foreign policy. And so it wasn't exactly an equal relationship, but they had loyal allies who mostly showed up and supported them and voted with them in the UN, and in return they carried the burden, both in terms of risk and cost, largely of European defence, and it suited both sides. And that's over now. I'm just looking around the room to see if there's anyone here who remembers the era before 1941. I don't think so. My mother does, she's 95. But that era that started in December 1941, when the Americans decided to go and join the war in Europe after Pearl Harbor, which they didn't have to, and with various ups and downs, Suez and various other things, survived until about 4 weeks ago, is now over. We don't have this idea of America as a sort of semi-benevolent hegemon. They certainly don't see us as a useful ally. And that's particularly tough for Britain because we are really joined at the hip on nuclear intelligence and all sorts of military planning. It's pretty tough for the rest of Europe. So how do we survive, Keir, in a post-Atlanticist European security order that we haven't yet built yet?
Honesty would be a good policy at this point. Now, for all European leaders, there's the same dilemma. Having to pretend that things are still normal with the White House in order to keep Trump on side, while we hope also urgently preparing for when that pretense is fallen through. Because for as long as possible, we need to keep the Americans on side as much as can be done. but we also need to be very ready for when that is no longer going to work. And this ought not to be a surprise. There were quite a few people who expressed shock at the way the United States had given. I have to confess that I sometimes have limited tolerance with that, because after all I wrote a book about exactly this situation, was writing it this time last year, because it was already plain the direction that the United States was going in. It's just the speed of travel that has been surprising. The US was already pulling back from the defense of Europe. We already had limitations placed on what European powers could do to defend themselves with American weapons. And what was the difference between Ukraine being told that it cannot strike into Russia with long-range precision strike munitions supplied by the United States, and, for example, Poland or Finland or the UK being told the same? Effectively, no difference. So this is not a new problem, and it is something about which considerable thought should already have been made. The problem, as Edward said, is particularly acute for the UK because the entirety of UK defence has been structured on the assumption that this country is never going to war except as part of a coalition, and the major member of that coalition is going to be the United States. So if that fundamental assumption no longer pertains, that means a complete redesign of defence capability in this country, and to other extents to different countries as well. And that is a process which ought to be starting now, because it is urgent. Because at the moment, Europe is in a state of acute vulnerability, for all the reasons we spoke about before, but in addition, this question mark suddenly over the commitment of the United States to a part of the world which it previously thought was important to its own prosperity and security, and now has decided absolutely is not. What that means is that whenever we see European militaries dependent on the United States for anything, whether it is presence of forces, whether it is intelligence support, whether it is logistics, that needs to be rethought. And it is the reason why we hear now again so many of the so-called fait accompli scenarios, the ways in which Russia could, in theory, move forward a short distance into one of our NATO allies in the easternmost part of the continent, like the Baltic states or Poland, dig in and say, come and get us, thereby triggering a collapse of NATO, because nobody's actually willing to go and get them, because they see the choice between surrender and nuclear war. All of those scenarios were off the table for almost a decade after NATO did the right thing by putting its enhanced forward presence forces in those states, so that there was no conversation about whether NATO was going to turn up or not. It was already there. Now, precisely because of this question mark over US commitment, all of those scenarios are again on the table and again realistic. That means that the clock is ticking for Europe to actually look to its own defences and how it can protect itself without the United States.
I should say we do weddings and bar mitzvahs as well. Should we have some questions? I apologise in advance. I have to leave at 25 to go to a fundraising dinner for Ukraine, so I apologise for that. But let's have some questions in advance. Any Ukrainians get first shot? Hands up, any Ukrainians want to ask a question? Yes, go ahead.
What do we have?
Give me mic, please.
It's a small room, they can be heard.
Thanks a lot, Victoria Dovichenko. And actually, that's the photo Falce do Gasperi. I just found out Italy. My question is actually about the words of coalition of willing, because in Ukrainian we are actually translating that coalition of brave, coalition of really willing, but in reality we have problems now in understanding. So what are the frameworks of this coalition of willing, how you see that? Especially that I was traveling now from Italy, there is no discussion as we are having it now among the society there, and it's really scary because even the politicians do not want to take into consideration that the enlarging or let's say boosting the defense spending is something necessary to be done before. And in many other countries within EU, now we're talking about plus UK in potentially, the situation is probably hectic because of the political choices some of them made. So what will be the message in this stance? Because it's not only urgent, it's already on fire, as we Ukrainians say. The house is on fire. Thank you.
The thing that most annoys me about the Western policy towards Ukraine is the idea of, yes, we're going to send you money, we're going to send a rainbow, the unicorn is going to go over the rainbow and then will point with its horn to a large pot of gold. We are appalling in making these unrealistic promises. To secure, if we take the West German model, imagine we stop the way Germany was divided. We were going to defend you properly the way we defended West Germany. We would need hundreds of thousands of troops and multiply by 3 because you need troops who've just come out and troops who are preparing to go in. We just don't have that. It's literally not going to happen. So anything we do is going to involve some substituting technology for mass. So it might be the Sky Shield idea, which I'm glad to see Lesia's here, and if any of you want more details about Sky Shield, see Lesia afterwards. It might be some other sort of deterrent, but it always comes back to the idea of what happens if it's triggered. So what happens if we do something and Russia doesn't like it and they decide to attack the country that's provided it? What happens then? So this whole idea of deterrence is based on a tripwire, and we don't have an answer to what happens when the tripwire is triggered. Or do we?
Well, you're not the only one that's confused by looking at what's been said about the framework, because so far most things that have been said publicly are nonsense. Now, in part that's inevitable, because of course nobody knows what this force is supposed to be designed for, because there aren't the conditions into which it can actually move. If it is supposed to be a peace support force, you need to know what kind of peace it is in the first place. So what we hope is that the conversations that have been being had so far, particularly on the military side, are about the art of the possible. If there are certain scenarios, what is it possible for European countries to do without the United States in order to ensure that the front line remains in Ukraine, and in order to deter Russia from restarting the war at a time of its choosing there, probably just shifting the target elsewhere. I have written about this at great and tedious length in something that was published through the Baltic Defence College in the middle of March, looking at a way to turn the aspirations that we've heard that are probably unachievable into something that can practically be done in terms of inserting European forces into Ukraine and thereby inserting Europe into the conversation about its own future. And that's available for free download, and I can send you to it later. But it's a long, long conversation, and not one that seems to be being had in public at the moment. It also, of course, draws on the Sky Shield initiative, which, unlike so many of these plans that are drawn from thin air, actually is based on a realistic appraisal of European air power and what it can achieve in Ukraine.
Let's have some more questions. Gentleman in the front and then the gentleman at the very back.
You say that we should continue to try to keep the Americans on board. How do we do that in circumstances when the Americans have made it completely clear that they don't want to remain on board?
Well, I would suggest that, and we have a wonderful picture here of one of the founding fathers of modern Europe. I'd suggest putting an enormous gold statue of Donald Trump up in the heart of Brussels. And I'm saying that he's one of the great founding fathers of modern Europe. And flatter the man. I mean, he's actually pretty transparent. And we should have called that Rare Earths Corporation the $1 trillion Trump Rare Earth, Eurasian Rare Earths thing. And just go for these big showy things and hope they work. If they don't work, it doesn't cost us very much.
I think they've already made their decisions. I don't think you're going to...
Well, you obviously know more.
Narcissistic Trump may be.
Well, I defer to your expertise, but I think there's nothing to be lost in trying transactional things and treat him like a toddler. What do you think here?
Yeah, embrace the art of the ludicrous. We did have a brief advantage in this country, of course, by having some fairly decorative royalty, which was utilized with thrusting a letter into Trump's hand in order to get him on side for whatever it was, 30 seconds or so. It is measures like that. It is nothing to do with statecraft. It is nothing to do with logical national policy. It is all to do with dealing with the whims of Trump and exploiting the moment when it is available in order to extend the time during which the attention of the wreckers within the Trump-Musk administration is not turned to those parts of the US extended levers of power which actually are vital for European security. Because up until now, they have not withdrawn US forces from Europe, aside from scheduled rotations. They may have immobilized them with spending bans and travel bans, which is a little bit inconvenient if you're a deployed force on another continent, but they have not started pulling them away. So, for as long as by whatever means we can maintain that pretense of normality, it is going to help. Again, I mentioned Canada earlier. The problem for Canada is it does not have that luxury. The normality has already gone unarguably, and so they are in the state of confrontation with the United States that will come to us all eventually, but if we can buy a breathing space in order to look to our defenses against our other big problem, Russia, then it will be worth the investment and it will be worth the ridiculous measures that have to be taken.
So play for time and plan like crazy. There was a gentleman at the very back, yes, in fact two gentlemen at the very back, and then we'll come to you. And
I think you sort of answered it right now in your last few words that you're playing for time. The only thing I would say is, where exactly does this leave Ukraine? Because when I go to these things and I'm in an American context or in an American panel discussion, this is night and day. You guys are polar opposites. You're not on the same page. Where does this leave Ukraine? Because what it does need right now, I would say, is something that's also lacking in Europe. It's not just a defense capability, but diplomatic capability. Because as much as everybody's going to say, make fun of Trump, you deal with what you have because you still need them. Because just,
so what's the question?
My point is, do you not think that the European Union and the European states lack some diplomatic skills to have let it get to this point?
Yes.
Where does it leave Ukraine right now? Because right now, they are in the worst situation. The idea that you guys are like this with the Americans, what do you want them to do? To fight 2-3 more years and buy time like that? I'd rather have a settlement and get some kind of an enforcement thing and then buy time. But right now, none of us are doing any favors for this country.
I think if there was a durable, lasting settlement, I don't see who would be standing in its way. The problem is that Putin isn't going to stop until he's stopped. And he's on the front foot, and he will continue to be on the front foot until someone does something that stops him being on the front foot. And I don't see, and you're right in a sense, Russia has an economy the size of Italy, and as Donald Tusk put it so beautifully, 500 million plus Europeans are begging 300 and something million Americans to defend them against 140 million Russians who can't beat 40 million Ukrainians. And so there is an enormous lump of economic power and potentially political and potentially military power in Europe, but it's not there yet. So I think what really worries me is that there will come a point where the Americans will pull the rug under the Ukrainians and the Europeans will say, we're still in, you're still fighting, we're still with you. Because we know what happens if Ukraine really loses. If the Russians eventually get to Kiev or Odessa or worse further on, we're talking 10 million refugees. This will be the most destabilising thing ever to happen to Europe since 19...
Can we honestly say we didn't see this coming 2 years?
Well, I mean, some of us have tried to warn the Europeans about it, but I think that the Europeans will stay in the end. And then we'll have a problem that the Americans will say, look, we brokered a deal. The Ukrainians won't accept it because the Europeans are egging them on. So now we're going to try some arm twisting the Europeans. And at that point, we're going to see things like the American forces in Europe told to stay at home and be home by Christmas. We're going to see the end of the US-UK nuclear agreement. We're going to see all sorts of things that will put us in, if we think we're in a mess now, they'll be even bigger mess later on. What do you think here?
Well, there's a reason why the kind of ceasefire that has been discussed over the last couple of months was resisted for so long by Ukraine and by those who had Ukraine's best interests at heart, because it was one of the worst case outcomes. Freezing the conflict, allowing Russia to sit on its occupied territories, allowing it to rebuild its forces in order to have another go with no long-term security guarantees. That was precisely what everybody wanted to avoid. Now, because of the change in US policy, it's been turned into one of the least worst available outcomes. And that is the reason why Ukraine is going along with it, because the alternatives are worse. But there's going to come a point when the combined demands on Ukraine of Russia and the United States are worse than fighting on without US support. If the trends that we see continue, Russian determination to push forward, United States determination to extract as much as possible through extortion from Kiev, if those continue the way they are at the moment, eventually there'll come a point where Ukraine will cut the United States loose instead of the other way round, because it is the only option. Because fighting on at that cost, particularly if European support does increase, is going to be less risky, less harmful, less mortgaging of the country's future than effectively selling it to Russia and the United States.
A final question, the gentleman in the blue at the back, yes.
Country we haven't heard much about is Turkey. Historically, they've been seen as NATO's most awkward member, but geographically in a position to help Ukraine, and they've got a large army. Do we need them for this?
If you look at the map, you always need Turkey.
Yeah, absolutely. Turkey is, in as much as it is a player which is slightly apart from NATO, that is not always a bad thing. Let's not forget that when we talk about deterrence of Russia and setting those red lines and setting those boundaries for acceptable behavior, Turkey has often shown how to do it when European countries have been far too reticent and far too concerned. In September of 2021, my colleagues at Chatham House published something I wrote called What Deters Russia? It didn't have a question mark on the end. It was about all of the different ways in which Russia has been dissuaded over history, past history and recent history, from doing something ridiculous by determined action. Case studies of when deterrence of Russia works and when it doesn't, and the clear historical patterns that come through. On the front cover of that, we chose a photograph which is an illustration of exactly what we wanted to get across. What is it that makes Russia stop and think? And it was a picture of Vladimir Putin and then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stopping and thinking while pondering on the table in front of them the flight data recorder, the black box from the Russian bomber that Turkey had shot down when their warnings that had gone unheeded for so long were ignored for so long that eventually Turkey lost its patience and went ahead and set a boundary. It is that kind of determined action to deter Russia and to set those boundaries that would have saved many, many lives since then, if only it were adopted by more countries than Turkey.
I just thought one final point, that all these awful mistakes we've made, we did this to ourselves. We didn't have Russian tanks going down the streets of London and Brussels and Berlin. We didn't have our leaders being forced at gunpoint to sign things they didn't agree with on threat of having their families taken off to go and die in labour camps. We did all this of our own free will because we were complacent and naive and most of all greedy. And the good thing about that is we could stop being those things, then we might start doing something better.
Well, I can only hope that this is the first of a series of discussions, because this was far too short, and I think we have many more questions in the audience. And please do stay on. Ed will have to go, but Keir will be with us for the reception. You can continue talking to Keir Giles. Buy his books. We're looking forward to your next book. I hear the working title is I Told You So. Again, is that right? Yes. And thank you, EU Delegation to the UK, for hosting us and partnering with us today. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Keir and Ed, for sharing your gloomy but honest insights. Thank you.